All right, we are ready to go. I'm going to write in green because photosynthesis. So you should understand that C6H12O6 plus 6O2 runs this way to produce carbon dioxide and water, 6 of each. This is the old equation you learned back in grade 9, 10, and maybe 11. But we also know that this equation can also run backwards this way. However, it's important to note that only one way is spontaneous. The green arrow represents the spontaneous reaction, which will proceed on its own. Once we zapped this with our little 2 ATP matches at the start, remember, to get the glucose in the right state, glucose 6-phosphate, and so on, everything else just kind of tumbles on down, and it all happens spontaneously, without too much extra happening. It's what we call an exergonic reaction. But the red arrow going backwards is not. It is not a spontaneous reaction, because look what's happening. We are taking these very simple molecules, right? This side of the equation has a very high amount of disorder. There's a lot of entropy over here. High disorder. But over here, we have the highly organized glucose molecule. So the entropy is quite low. Things tend to proceed towards disorder. So the green arrow makes sense. The red arrow requires energy input. And of course, we know that the energy input comes from, I'll write it in this nice yellow, sunlight. Plants need to acquire energy from sunlight in order to accomplish this task of making little molecules like CO2 and water turn into the complicated glucose molecule. And they do that through the magic of a special thing called chlorophyll. So the sunlight is the energy input that drives this equation backwards against its will, so to speak, from its high entropy state to low entropy state. We're putting energy in. Okay, so we know that in plant cells, can I go ahead? Or we know that in plant cells we have the chloroplast, which is an organelle. So let's draw this big sort of circular chloroplast, and let's put down here, or maybe up here, chloroplast. You got to not confuse chloroplast with chlorophyll. Chloroplast is the organelle that contains all of these structures we're about to draw, whereas chlorophyll is the actual pigment or chemical that's inside here that's going to do a lot of the work for us. It's the sunlight capturing molecule. Okay, so inside here, it's a little bit different from the mitochondrion. I'm going to use a thinner line. What we have in here, it looks like under the microscope, the electron microscope, little stacks of pancakes, essentially. It's a membrane-bound structure. And so what happens is this membrane creates these stacks like this. And these stacks are all over the place, right? So it's full of them. So we'll draw a bunch of stacks. Now what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to draw this little stack, and I'm going to draw him broken open, cut away, right there. And I'm going to get my crayon here, and I'm going to color that in a little bit so we have a nice sort of, let's go like this. Look at how nice this is. Okay, and then I'm going to use a darker green here to show that this is cut away, sort of the inside of one of those little stacks, inside the pancake. All right. So now we have to have some sort of names, okay? Now the picture here, yeah. There is a double membrane on this as well. There's an outer and an inner membrane. So maybe we should add another membrane here around the outside, or maybe around the inside. Because the inner membrane It doesn't show this in pictures, but the inner membrane, I think, is sort of contiguous with the stroma, with these stacks. Not the stroma, the thylakoids, the stacks. But not critical for what we're going to do, because the special magic dance here is not across the inner membrane of the chloroplast like it was with the mitochondrion. The special magic dance here is inside, across the membrane of these little pancake structures. Okay? So a stack of these, the whole stack, is called a granum, which is just a word that means a sort of a blob or a granule, a grain. Those all come from the same root. One of the little pancakes is called a thylakoid. And the membrane that surrounds it is called the thylakoid membrane. That's the membrane we're going to be talking about. So if I point here to the actual membrane itself, thylakoid membrane, that's where we're going to find a very similar setup to electron transport. We're going to see all these protein molecules that are lodged in this membrane, and they're going to use light energy to make cool stuff happen. And again, it will be because electrons are being moved and transferred. And there will be concentration gradients. It's very similar to what we had before. Membrane, good. Now, inside, this is why I broke this guy up. This area inside is called the thylakoid space. Thylakoid space. And then the sort of fluid on the outside here is called the stroma. So the thylakoid membrane is the thing we're going to be talking about. And it's the membrane that surrounds these little pancakes. And it's the movement of things from the stroma into the thylakoid space, across the thylakoid membrane, and back again, that create the action for what we're talking about. So unlike the mitochondrion, which was, this inner membrane was where all the action happened, and that inner membrane was sort of, remember how it was all like this, all spirally and bent up. Instead, in the chloroplast, this membrane forms these specific structures. And of course, these structures contain the chlorophyll, right? So the chlorophyll is found inside the thylakoids. So maybe up where I've written thylakoid, you might put in brackets here, contains the chlorophyll. Contains chlorophyll. I don't have room, but you certainly might. And of course, there are many thylakoids in these chloroplasts, which is what makes them look green, because chlorophyll is the green pigment, right? So that's kind of the basic structure of the whole thing. And now, because we're dealing with light, we have to talk a little bit about light. We have to actually do a little bit of physics. Are we good to go, or should I? All right, we're bumping ahead, and we're going to now talk about light. Just a little bit of physics to understand how this works. Light is a form of energy, right? Obviously, we know that. It's a form of energy. Instead of energy that's found in chemical bonds, it's a form of energy. In fact, it's what we would call electromagnetic energy. Now, what the heck is that? Well, electromagnetic energy is energy that is it's a kind of kinetic energy in a way. It has to do with movement, in particular vibrations. And so we have to understand that all around us, I'm going to get a smaller, is something called the electromagnetic field. Right? It took us a long time to figure this out, but we have discovered that this electromagnetic field does exist. And it's just that humans aren't very good at sensing most of it. There's only one small piece of it that we can sort of sense, and that, of course, is our eyes, which can pick up light and see things. But other animals have a little bit better ability to sense. Sharks can sense more of it than we can. Some things can see a wider range of it than we can. They can see, bumblebees can see ultraviolet light. We can't, stuff like that. But this electromagnetic field is basically, imagine it to be this huge sort of ocean that's invisible all around us. It's like an ocean, very much, if we were to use an analogy. If you were a fish and you lived in the ocean, then there's two things that could happen if you're a fish. If there were wiggly currents and waves in the water, they would push you around and move you. They would influence your life, right? You'd be like, whoa, currents, and you'd get pushed and pulled by this by this invisible ocean. And the other thing that could happen is if you were a fish in the ocean and you moved, you would make wiggles that would create waves also. And so these waves or ripples or vibrations in the ocean are what fish actually can be sensitive to. They have a lateral line across the side of their body. Did anybody dissect the perch? Not so, yeah? Did you talk about the lateral line? It's sort of the line on a fish. It's right around the spot, if this is a fish, sort of between the belly part, the light-colored belly, and it's a little bit above that, actually, and the dark top. And what it is, it's a whole bunch of cells that are sensitive to pressure changes. So if there's currents and things in the water, the fish can feel it. So it doesn't have to see you. If you walk near a fish, you create a disturbance in the water, which the fish can feel at a distance because of the water waves that travel through the water. Likewise, we've discovered that the electromagnetic field is very much like this. If you have a particle that has a charge, a plus or a minus, it doesn't really matter. The electromagnetic field is all about charges. So only charged things are like the fish that live in it. If you have a charged object and there are waves in the field, those waves will cause the charged object to move and wiggle just like the fish. And if the charged object itself is pushed or wiggled, it will create waves in this electromagnetic field. And so this is a way, just like fish can communicate, they can infer information about their surroundings by being sensitive to these ripples. Charged objects can sort of communicate with each other in this invisible ocean of electromagnetic field. And of course, we call these ripples electromagnetic waves. And of course, there's energy involved because something has to make the wiggle. Something has to push or disturb the water. So the energy, electromagnetic waves, and of course they contain energy because they are wiggly. Energy, that says energy. They contain energy in their wiggles, just like water contains energy. If you've ever been to the wave pool, you know how much energy those waves have because they can knock you flying if you're in the right spot in the wave pool. And even if you're out deep where the waves are more rolly, they still have a lot of energy because they are lifting you up and down, aren't they, as you bob on the big waves. And lifting something requires energy, remember from physics. So the electromagnetic waves contain energy. And they work like this. Let's say you go to camp and you've got a nice dock out here, right, in the water. And you go to the edge of the dock one morning and it's actually very still. I'm gonna erase that water and make it nice, still water. Go to the edge of the dock. Whoops, that was supposed to be water. Crap. Okay. And now we've got something happening. I don't know why. Okay, black. Here's your dock, and here's the still water. So what you do is maybe it's early morning, and last night there was a bit of a party, and you find a little cork from a wine bottle floating right there, sitting in the water. And of course, it's just sitting there because the water's so still, right? You don't do anything. You go up there, you can't resist poking it. So you push it, and then it begins to bob up and down. And as it begins to bob up and down, it makes little ripply waves that go out in all directions. If you're looking down on it, you'd see these waves going out, ripples, right? Out from your cork. Sure. a cork would make ripples. They would make small ripples. The question was if the cork is really small. And again, this is just an analogy, but yeah, they would make small ripples. If you bob the cork, you would see little ripples. Then what happens is those ripples would travel. And what's interesting, or what's kind of cool, is that over here at your neighbor's dock, right, the water's out here, and there's a cork sitting in that water as well, not moving. You wiggle this cork up and down, and those ripples will go through the water, and they will travel over here, and all of a sudden, when that cork feels the ripples, it will begin to bob up and down. And you have not even touched it. All you touched was the cork over here. And so the water has served as a medium to transfer the energy you gave one cork to the other cork, which has now got that energy. So the wave or ripple of water you created carries the energy to the other cork. And this is how we communicate with electromagnetic radiation, like microwaves, right? Our cell phones don't have corks in them, but they have electrons in them. And so if you take an electron, which is a charged object, and you shake it around, it actually makes waves in the surrounding electromagnetic field. And those waves take off out of your phone through the air. And they end up going to somebody else's phone, and there'll be electrons in that phone that are just sitting there doing nothing when all of a sudden this wave comes along, and they will begin to shake. And the cool thing is you can just do a random shake, or you can shake in a pattern. You could poke that cork up, down, down, up, 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 down, and you could make a ripple that kind of went in a weird way, and so the ripple could encode actual information. And this is how cell phones work. We use electrons to encode the information, which is essentially our voice or our texting, and we send it by wiggling those electrons in exactly the right pattern to mimic whatever the thing is, and it gets to another phone and it has the same effect. So that's what light can do, which is really cool. For us, though, what we're interested in is the energy of the waves. Waves can have more energy depending on what color they are. It turns out that if you take a wave, right, and you measure the distance between the two crests, that's called a wavelength. And we use the little Greek lambda. Lambda stands for L, which is a length. And that's telling us how much wavelength the light has, or the wave has. And of course, this wave is also a wiggly wave, but it has a much shorter wavelength. Shorter wavelengths have more energy than longer wavelengths. And that kind of makes sense, because if you were to make this top one, your finger would bob the cork down, 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 down. Whereas to make the bottom one, you'd have to go down, 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 down. You get tired faster. You're putting more energy into the vibration. There are more vibrations per second, in other words, right? So the wavelength of light determines how much energy it has. And we know that light comes in a variety of wavelengths. The longest wavelengths, which we call radio waves, are very long, maybe 1 kilometer or more. Then we have another sort of slightly shorter version called microwaves. And then we have a short version still called infrared. And these waves we can't sense. Living things, well, some might, but most humans don't anyway. The only one we can sense is this one. This one right here, this infrared run. This is what we feel heat. When you're sitting by a campfire and you can feel the warmth of the fire, it's because there are waves of that wavelength. Then what happens is you get a whole new set of waves. Okay. Oops, I shouldn't have gone up there. The next one is red. The wavelength of this light has just the right energy so that when it goes into your eyeballs and onto your retina, there are molecules in there. And those molecules can feel this wave. It's like suddenly they're the cork. And when these waves come in, these molecules begin to bob up and down on that wave. And when they do, of course, the energy of the wave is transferred to the molecule. And the molecule can then transfer that energy in several different ways to result in a nerve impulse that tells you you're seeing red light. Okay? And then, of course, I don't have orange on here, do I? Maybe I do if I look in here. Here's orange. Orange would be a little shorter still. Orange is a little shorter still. Hopefully we're not going to restart here. Hoping that's going to happen later. Then yellow, red, orange, yellow. Green, blue, and violet. And of course they're getting shorter each time. I'm trying to make the squiggles shorter and shorter. And this is called the visible light spectrum. This section is the visible light spectrum because humans can see this. That's all. It's not very important other than that. It just happens to be the ones that we can see with our eyes. And the reason is because these waves are just the right size to wiggle the molecules inside of our retinas, whereas the other ones are either too big or too small. Then what happens is we get, I'm going to draw a little dashed line here with this cool little dash thing. Look at that. This dashed line, look at how cool that is. Modern technology. There was a professor who could do that with chalk. And he would hold the chalk and he would vibrate it as he drew it across the board, and he was able to make dotted lines with chalk on the board. It was amazing. And I practiced it. I tried to learn it, but then of course we stopped using blackboard, so what's the point? Next we have a bunch of waves that get really short. This one is called ultraviolet. Question? Oh, we're going to get to that. The question is what gives a substance its color, and so we want to know why chlorophyll is green, and that's what we're going to get to in just a couple of minutes, so just hang on to that. Ultraviolet light, this wiggle is such a strong wiggle, it has so much energy that instead of causing the molecules to wiggle and bounce, it can actually cause them to break. It can break molecules apart. It can eject electrons completely out of the molecule, and so it's called ionizing. That's what this line means. Everything on this side is what we call ionizing, which means the waves now have enough energy to actually do damage rather than just agitate. Yep. Well, radioactive elements will sometimes give off ionizing radiation as part of their processes, yes. So a radioactive element emits. Yeah, alpha rays are and beta rays and gamma rays. In fact, one of these we're going to get to is actually called a gamma ray. So those are all ionizing radiation, and that's why those radioactive elements are dangerous, because they emit. What they're doing in the radioactive elements is their nuclei is unstable, and it's trying to achieve stability by rearranging itself, essentially. And essentially what happens is protons turn into neutrons, and neutrons turn into protons. And in that process, energy is released. And the energy is in the form of these ionizing rays. Does that make sense? So these are called the X-rays. This was the ultraviolet rays. And then the gamma rays, very, very high, powerful rays. And this goes on. Supernova explosions produce extremely short wavelengths, which are super high energy. We call these cosmic rays. We're not going to get into all that because that's physics. We just want to look at the visible light region. Light from the sun, right, contains all of these waves. Almost all of the ionizing rays don't hit the surface of the Earth because of our ozone layer, which protects us from radiation. Only some of the ultraviolet gets through and gives us a suntan or a sunburn if we're not careful. And the visible light then is sort of the main bulk of what biological things, I guess, are interested in as sunlight. What makes things what color they are? Well, there's two things that can happen when light hits something. When a wave of light hits something, here's a wave. When it hits an atom or a molecule, there's two things that can happen. One, if it's just the right size, you'll know that the atom has a nucleus and it has these energy levels of electrons around it, right? And these energy levels are very specific differences apart. If you have a wave that carries just the right size of energy, and it hits this electron here, the extra energy will cause the electron to jump up to a higher level of energy. But it has to be just the right size wave. Nothing in between will work. And when that happens, the electron jumps up. But remember, there's already electrons up there in that level, and they're kind of like, hey, three's a crowd, because of the Pauli exclusion principle. Only 2 electrons can live in an orbital at the same time. So this electron, they kick it out, and it has to jump right back where it belonged. And in order to do that, it has to get rid of the very energy it got. So it makes a new wave that trickles out, which is exactly the same as the old wave. And we say that this light has been reflected. It's been reflected off of the atom. Now, a different size wave that were to come in might be not the right size to move one of these electrons. Maybe it would move a different electron. And that electron that's in closer, for instance, would jump with a smaller energy. Or actually, it would have actually a larger energy. And what would happen is you would get an X-ray or something. But another thing that can happen is that the wave can just cause sort of a shaky vibration of the entire molecule or the entire atom, which of course is what we call heat. So the wave can turn into heat if it's not the right size to promote electrons as such. It can also just turn into heat. If it turns into heat, if it turns to heat, we say it is absorbed. Now, it doesn't have to be turned to heat. It's turned into something. So heat, maybe I should say, it turns into, I'm going to say, heat or chemical energy, because that's what we're going to get, right? When light is absorbed by the chlorophyll, it shakes the molecules, it moves the electrons around, and it turns into heat, but I'm going to write over here, chemical energy. So you can write or chemical energy. We say that it's absorbed. So the wavy energy has gone into the electrons, and it's caused the electrons to shift or move or change their energy. And of course, that could change the shape of something. It could change the whole way the molecule works, right? Question. Okay, so an energized electron is an electron that has been given this extra energy, and it wants to revert back to its lower energy state. And so it'll do that by coupling with many different reactions along the way, which will eventually allow us to build glucose out of carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so the next picture we're going to draw is a sort of a diagrammatic picture of what happens inside. So let's first make a little list here. Other chemicals can also absorb light and turn it into energy. Okay, so there are two. There's chlorophyll A, and chlorophyll B. There's two types here, and we're gonna see what their rules are. But there's also another group called the carotenoids. These are molecules that also can accept different lights. And of course, the differences are that they all accept different frequencies or different wavelengths of light. So some of them might really be good at absorbing orange light, and some are good at absorbing purple light or blue light, and various colors. Now, you asked me before, how do we know what color something is? And if you reflect light, as we drew up here, if you reflect light, that's the color you would appear to be. So if you're green, it means you are reflecting green light. So that means that plants are actually not using green light very much. What they're absorbing are all the other colors, because those colors aren't what we see when we look at plants. Now, of course, right now, we can see it's fall, and the leaves have all the beautiful colors. So what typically happens is that all of these different pigments, these carotenoids and these chlorophylls and so on, They all, there's even other ones, they're called xanthophylls and anthocyanins and all kinds of crazy pigments. They also help absorb light of different frequencies, but their role is far less. Chlorophyll is the big one. So in a typical plant, there's way more chlorophyll, which means the plant is pretty much looking green all the time. But in the fall, deciduous trees, like the ones we have up here, they begin to sense the shortening day and the less intensity of the sunlight, and they shut down their chlorophyll production. And the chlorophyll just stops being made. So the greenness is starting to disappear. Well, underneath that green are all these other colors that have been there all along. They've just been overshadowed by the green. And so as the green disappears, the other colors are coming through temporarily. Now they are also shutting down. So eventually they'll shut down and the leaf turns brown and dies and falls off. But for a brief moment, we get to see some of the other colors of these other pigments that are in the leaf because the chlorophyll is less and less and less as the fall goes on. So that's kind of an interesting side point. Okay. So basically what we have here is what we call an antenna complex. So let's make a title here. The antenna complex. And again, this is just going to be a sort of a diagrammatic thing to basically understand what's going on. Okay? So in the antenna complex, we call it an antenna because it's receiving the light. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a picture. Let's do it like this. Let's draw a darker green. Whoops, dark green, sort of here in the middle. Shaded in. And then we'll go back to lighter green, and we'll draw some of these lighter greens all around. And these are going to represent different chlorophyll molecules, sort of all over the place here. And then we'll have, I'll draw an orange one down here. That's the carotenoid. They're kind of orangey because they're like carrots, right? Carotenoids are found in carrots. And so they make carrots orange, and so that's how the name they came up with the name. Okay. So basically what happens is you have two basic parts. You have the collectors, which are these chlorophylls that are all around. They're the antenna chlorophyll, okay? And so the antenna chlorophyll are capturing light. So how can I draw sunlight? Maybe yellow? Let's have light coming in here. And it strikes one of these antenna complexes. And when it does, the energy of that wave causes some of the electrons to be energized. And of course, there's a complex sort of bouncing around. Whereas this one energizes, and then those electrons get energized. And then these electrons are energized, and then those electrons are energized. And it bounces around, but it eventually makes its way to this particular guy right here, who's sort of like the final chlorophyll in the process. Okay, so he's kind of like the last acceptor. And then okay, so we're carrying on here. We've got this antenna complex that I've drawn. I'm going to put another couple of lights. So light hits here. Light might also hit the carotenoid guy, the orange guy. And that would mean that his energy could be bounced here and bounced to here. Eventually, what we want to understand is that the dark green guy, I'm going to do a little key over here. The dark green guy is the chlorophyll A. The lighter green dudes are the chlorophyll Bs. Up off the chlorophyll B. And the orange guys are the carotenoids. And so all we need to understand is that these are all OI carotenoids. These are all pigment molecules that can absorb light of different wavelengths. So the light is the yellow arrows coming in, and what happens is it hits the chlorophyll B and the carotenoids, and excites those electrons in various ways. They act sort of like handoff, like a game of hot potato, where the energy in the electrons is transferred from one to the other, and bounces around until it lands on the chlorophyll A, which is the top dark green guy. And then the chlorophyll A is going to transfer that to something called the Electron Acceptor, which I'm going to put here as a red box. So those final electrons end up being handed off to the Electron Acceptor, which again is a molecule, right? These are all just molecules. And all of these molecules are embedded in a protein called a complex, or actually it's called a photosystem. We're going to get to that shortly. So this red guy, he is the Electron Acceptor. Okay? And so that's what's happening. That's why we call it an antenna complex, because the other chlorophyll, the chlorophyll B and the carotenoids, are sort of gathering the light energy. They're all being hit, and their electrons are getting excited, which means they're being risen or raised to a higher energy state. And they sort of all focus those electrons towards the chlorophyll A, which ends up getting them at the end. And then the chlorophyll A then transfers the electrons to the electron acceptor. And that sort of is what activates or starts the whole process off. We'll get to that in the next video. I just want to take a minute and show you what's called an absorption spectrum. But before I do, does anybody have any questions about this antenna complex and how it works? Right? So these two guys down here are sort of focusing the light energy, and they're delivering it to the chlorophyll A through electrons, which then transfers those electrons to the electron acceptor. And that's what we really have to understand about this. Now, just to show you, in terms of, we're talking about light and wavelengths, we can do what's called an absorption spectrum. So we can draw a little graph. And under the graph, we can have sort of our colors, right? So we can have our red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet spectrum. And I'm going to just use this book here because it has the graph, just to kind of give you something to see. So let's put the red end here, red. Let's go to orange, yellow, green, blue, and ultimately the violet. So these colors are kind of showing us the wavelengths. If we want to put the numbers on, for those of you who are all into physics, then this is about 700 nanometers. That's the actual wavelength measured in meters. A nanometer is a billionth of a meter. And this end is about 400 nanometers. And so it goes 400, 500, 600. We could, if that's 400, then whatever. That's just kind of a range. But what's interesting is we can draw some lines on here. So I'll take this green line. The green line that I'm going to draw is going to be chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A absorbs energy pretty much in the purple end and a little blob in the sort of red end. So if you were to draw the line of absorbing, you'd see chlorophyll A would be high here, low here, and then a little bit sort of an uptick right here. So those two bumps represent the kind of colors of light that chlorophyll A is really good at absorbing. Notice it doesn't absorb green or yellow, which means it reflects them, which is why most trees have a greenish or yellowy green colors, because those are being reflected. Chlorophyll B, which I'll have to do in a different color, maybe I can do it in red. So the red line will be chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll B has a slightly different picture. It sort of absorbs almost into the green part. So chlorophyll B is very high, right about here, just in the beginnings of the green, and then it drops off, and there's a little blip sort of right here. So it's absorbing slightly different wavelengths. And then the carotenoids, which I'll do in this purple color, carotenoids, they tend to absorb sort of a lot of purple. I'm going to say something like this. And then they sort of go over here like this, and they absorb there, and then they drop down, and they pretty much stay down for the rest. So if you look at this, the colors of light that are absorbed or used by the plant to excite those electrons that we talked about are primarily in the purpley blue end and just a little bit into the green. My picture's a bit off. I think if I were to change it, I'm not going to mess with it because it's already where it is, but take this green crayon. I think my green should be a little more over here, and my blue should kind of come in here a bit more, because most of the green. So what we're just trying to see here is a sort of a graphical view of which wavelengths and which colors are being used by the plant. And it looks like it's the purple and blue and just a touch of the green, right? The bulk of the plant's light energy is being coming from the bluey purple end right here, and a little bit of the red end. So if you ever grow plants, you'll often notice sometimes in nurseries and things, they'll have purpley lights where the plants are, because the purple light is the one that they use the most for photosynthesis. Most of the green and yellow is reflected away to our eyes, making the plants look green, which means they're not actually using those wavelengths of light. The purpley blue are the shortest, which means they're also the highest energy of the visible light. So it's using the highest energy of visible light. In fact, if you go much higher than this, you turn into ultraviolet, remember? Which is dangerous because it ionizes. So the plants have evolved to use the most energetic light they can from the sun without crossing that dotted line into the dangerous ionizing radiation, which is kind of cool. So that's just sort of that. And so that ends our little discussion on chlorophyll and the antenna complex. This is the part we want to really sort of get into our heads, how the light energy is hitting these chlorophyll bees and carotenoids, exciting the electrons, which eventually bounce around and are sort of directed towards the chlorophyll A, which then takes them. And this idea of handing those electrons to the electron acceptor, which again, these are all sort of bound together in a giant protein, that's what starts off the whole thing, because it causes a very huge electronegativity difference in the complex. If you give those high energy electrons to the acceptor is going to become very negative, and this is going to become very positive. And that's going to cause something really cool to happen, as we'll see in the next video. It's actually going to be the breaking up of a water molecule, which means that this particular chlorophyll that's doing this complex, is a very powerful oxidizer. In fact, it's the most powerful biological oxidizer that we know, powered by sunlight. But we'll stop there and go to the next video.